Welcome to another edition of Digital Conversations under the FlexPo Plus banner. We have two great guests today who are joining us. We have Dhaval Shah from SABIC and Bob Bauman from Polymer Consulting International. Again, as I've said in some of our earlier conversations, we were looking to do all of this in person. COVID's kind of put paid to some of that, but we are excited that this great slate of speakers that we have signed up for FlexPo this year agreed to make some time available to have these informal digital conversations. And that's the reason we are here. So let's get started without much ado. I'd like to request both of my fellow panelists to introduce themselves here. Dhaval, we'll start with you.
Okay. So first of all, Uday, thanks for having me here. It's great to interact virtually with the entire audience. But of course, hopefully at some point of time, we have the opportunity to do it live. So my name is Dhaval Shah. I currently lead the corporate research team in SABIC. By training, I'm a chemical engineer. Have spent 20 years in the petrochemical industry, all of it on the R&D side of things, but of course, significant exposure to the business element as well. Started my career with GE Plastics out of Mount Vernon, supporting the crystalline products line. And then when GE Plastics was acquired by SABIC in 2007, transitioned over to SABIC and have continued in a variety of different R&D roles in SABIC. Also had an interesting opportunity to spend 2 years actually in Saudi Arabia, leading the new materials team at one of the research centers close to the university. I'm based in Houston at our regional hub and the R&D center here. Over to you, Uday.
Thanks. Thanks, Dhaval. Bob, if I could request you to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Hey, that's what I'm here for. Basically, this is my 54th year in the industry. So I go back pretty far to when ethylene crackers were around 300,000 tons as a world scale cracker, and people were buying ethylene instead of making ethylene. Well, they made it and bought it. Now it's changed quite dramatically. You have to really be back integrated to really understand what is going on in the economics of this business with ethylene. However, propylene is a little different, and we'll talk about this a little later. But I started my career in 1966 with USI Chemicals, US Industrial Chemicals, then owned by National Distillers and Chemicals. Now it's part of LyondellBasell. I worked for them from 66 to 73 in the plant. So I have actually made polyethylene, I've made vinyl acetate, I was in production, I was in technical support. In 1973, I transferred to the strategic planning group at USI on 99 Park Avenue. And then in 1980, the company made a decision to move to Cincinnati, and I decided not to move to Cincinnati. Actually, my wife decided that I should not move to Cincinnati. So I joined Chem Systems in 1980 and stayed with them for 28 years, leading the polymer business practice for the Americas and Asia. I retired in 2008, not to stop working, but I promised my wife I would do other things. So I'm doing other things, and I set up the company Polymer Consulting International, and I've been quite successful in that. In fact, if I only had one regret, is I didn't retire sooner, because then I would make more money than working for a company. But at the end of the day, I'm still working. People ask me when I'll stop, and I'll stop when I drop. I just love it too much.
Thanks, Bob. And one of the other things that you've been working on in the last few years has been writing a couple of books, right? It's now you're on your second book thing, or?
Well, second novel. I published the first novel in 2012, then a non-fiction book, and now my other novel is going to be published within the next month.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So excellent. So thanks again for making time. So let's get started a little bit here, right? We can't really have a conversation, as I was saying earlier, without talking about COVID. Can you talk a little bit about how COVID's impacted your company, Dhaval, and how your company is coping with all of that? If you guys are in that reopening phase or returning to some sort of a new normal? What's that looking like? Some color there would be very interesting.
Yeah, so before I get into that, just a brief introduction of SABIC for some of the viewers who might not know it. SABIC is one of the largest petrochemical companies in the world now, headquartered in Saudi Arabia. From regional beginnings back in the 70s, really has grown to become a giant now with a global asset base, global customer channels, very diversified portfolio of products, right? So connecting that to COVID, certainly it's been, I don't know if interesting is the right word, but certainly it's been a year full of surprises and also some interesting learnings, right? So with respect to COVID, majority of our assets have been running all through the chemicals crisis globally, through the COVID crisis, excuse me, globally. And the reason being is pretty much the chemical industry has been granted the essential industry status in most countries around the world. And so our plants have been able to run, I think with the exception of maybe one country in South America, we've been able to continue production all the way through. And as most of the viewers may know, that the chemical industry generally has a very high safety standard and safety practices. So touchwood, we've been able to run our assets without any significant issues all through the crisis. When it comes to a lot of the office functions and the backroom functions, that's where there has been a significant shift to the work from home piece. And also many of the R&D labs are operating at minimal capacity just to keep them going. And so I think that's where the major change has been felt, that it's really a significant transition into the virtual workplace for a more conservative industry, so to say. But touchwood, it has turned out okay. There have been no major hiccups. The only other piece is the engagement with customers and the interaction with customers, which used to be a lot more of face-to-face and live discussions. A lot of it has moved to the virtual place, and we are finding out that there might be a happy medium there where you need a little bit of both. So that in a nutshell is where we are today.
Yeah, probably the Salesforce likes not being on a plane all the time.
Yes.
Although as we'll get into it, if we don't quite get jet fuel demand picking back up again, a lot of the feedstock picture is going to get more and more muddled. But thanks, Dhaval. That's helpful. Bob, how are you seeing the chemical operators kind of respond in and around COVID? How do you see COVID kind of impacting the chemical industry today?
Well, for one thing, like you said, travel is out. So a lot of people whom I've spoken to who are on a plane every month, they haven't been on a plane since January or February. We're thankful for Zoom and Microsoft because that at least brings you face to face. But all plants that I'm aware of are generally operating in the United States, but in many cases they've shut down some capacity. They've idled capacity because COVID-19 has really impacted demand. And there is where we really see the problem, particularly in durables. So cars are down, and that means polypropylene is down, and propylene is down. So there has been some shutdowns. In terms of, say, headquarters, I say for the most part, they have been empty. And I think they're starting to come back on a rotating schedule. And there are some exemptions, but in general, I think it's slowly creeping back in terms of the impact of COVID. I mean, I have not been on a plane since January. This is the longest period in my life that I have not been on a plane for such a long time. But I do interact with people on the phone, and again, Zoom video and Microsoft video. I just had a big conference with the CEO yesterday. So we can do that, but at the end of the day, we really need a vaccine.
Fair enough, Bob. That's helpful. One of the other things I think that COVID has done is, in the run up to, I guess, 2020, right? There's just been a lot of interest on the consumer side around sustainability, around improving the broader environmental footprint of plastics and things like that, right? That's driven all this interest in the circular economy and plastic waste minimization, conversion, and all that stuff. But I think COVID's really clarified the value proposition of plastics to a large extent in ways that probably the chemical industry never did on its own, or wasn't effective in kind of demonstrating and establishing that value proposition. But it seems to have really established, how effective plastics, the effective role that plastics play. So I'm curious, Dhaval, I'm sure this is a big part of conversations inside one of the large chemical players. I'm
Yes.
curious how you see some of that.
Oh, absolutely. So, and you hear these days of the K-shaped recovery, right? That there are some parts of the industry that are benefiting due to the COVID and some which are related to depressed. And interesting as we look at all the different behaviors, right? So personal hygiene, a lot of the single-use disposable materials, definitely the demand for them is quite robust, just given all the hygiene-related challenges due to COVID. Bob made a comment around durables, and we certainly saw that significantly in the auto segment, right, where with nobody buying cars and a lot of their manufacturing facilities either idling or operating at lower capacities, there was a significant impact on the auto-related materials demand. So we do see that real bifurcation in many of our segments where we are seeing some really good pickup in some areas, but in some areas we certainly see more of a deflation, for lack of a better word. But back to the whole circular economy thing. So we believe that there is a short to medium term impact of the COVID, but there is a long-term dynamic at play. And long-term, we still believe that some of the pressures that we have heard about plastic waste and such, despite all the excellent attributes that plastics brings in terms of, especially during its use phase, we believe that in long term, those pressures will still stay, and the industry has to work with the value chain to provide those solutions. But in the short to medium term, we do anticipate that they are going to be very, very critical in navigating our path out of this crisis. So that's I think where we stand with this product.
Thanks, Dhaval. That's helpful. Bob, how do you see COVID impacting this? I guess this conversation around circular economy, sustainability, and these broader themes that we have seen over the last couple of years.
Well, there is no doubt in my mind that plastics have mitigated deaths and contagion, without a doubt. I mean, you look at protective equipment, face masks, polypropylene woven, everything that's out there. But the problem with that is it's going to be short memory. People remember it for a year and a half, and you can talk about it, but year and a half, 2 years from now, this will be just another thing like a hurricane that has passed through, and everybody will focus on the disposability of plastics in the circular economy. You know, we have a number of organizations that have sprung up, some with like $1 billion budget. People are starting to mine the ocean. I mean, at the end of the day, the industry, this is the #1 issue facing the industry for me. It could absolutely impact long-term demand and as well as short-term demand. Single-use products in 10 years, maybe 50% of what it is now. So without a doubt, and I think companies recognize this. If you go to almost any company's website, you will see something on sustainability and the circular economy. I have not seen one in any company that does not have something addressing that. So they realize it. Some people might say it's too little, too late, but at least it's being addressed now where it wasn't 10 years ago.
No, that's helpful, Bob, and I always like the clear ways in which you make that compelling argument. So that's, and I think what you're saying also relates to what Dhaval was talking about earlier, which is that, yeah, I think in the short term, there's a very clear visibility into the value proposition that plastics bring, but in the medium to longer term, memories are short, people are going to forget, and some of those drivers that we have seen in the last couple of years will continue to be fairly relevant. So to a large extent, right, a lot of the work that's been put in over the last few years around this area probably will continue. And in fact, probably that's the right direction for a lot of these companies to be thinking about. Excellent. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about the main, I guess, topic of our conversation here today. And we want to talk a little bit about, broadly speaking, right, feedstocks, right? I mean, and again, I leave that interpretation to you, right? We can look at the feedstocks issue in multiple ways. We can look at it as feedstocks going into an ethylene, into a steam cracker, or we can look at it in terms of olefins that are feeding some of the downstream units further down as well. So please feel free to view it broadly from whatever lens that you see makes most sense. Maybe Bob, I'll start here with you. What's the feedstock? What are some, I guess, key issues in and around feedstocks that you have seen, let's say, this year?
Well, this year is probably not a good year to look at because of COVID-19. But if you look at the past couple of years, you really have to actually say go back to around 2008 and the typical shale gas revolution. That really changed, I think, everything globally. At the end of the day, shale gas represents an abundant, low-cost supply of methane, ethane, and propane in North America. And it has revolutionized the industry. For example, it's hard to find a naphtha cracker today. Most naphtha crackers have changed to ethane, and that created a propylene shortage. You look at the number of builds that are going on due to shale gas, and it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Crackers, logistics, everything related to the petrochemical industry has been impacted by shale gas. And there's no end to it. According to numbers that have been published by the government, we have 50 to 100 years left of shale gas going around the country. It's become such an important factor that we're exporting ethane, propane, ethylene, and propylene, where 10 years ago, we were building terminals to import LNGs and feedstocks. So that's the number one big thing that has happened. Shale gas, ethylene, ethane, and propane. And then, of course, the oil glut. Oil prices in 2011, 2012, when people were making these investment decisions, $5, $6, $7, $8, $10 billion, oil was over 100. When they started up, oil was roughly 50 or 60, and now it's down even lower. The U.S. still has an advantage. If you look at the ethane, the natural gas to oil ratio, it's still above 15. Anything above 7 gives the U.S. an advantage in the export market. So at the end of the day, North America will be the new Middle East. We have Middle East companies now investing in North America in a great extent, U.S. and Canada. They're looking at acquisitions and they're looking at organic growth, joint ventures. So I would say we have a dramatic shift in the last 10 years in the feedstock area.
Dhaval, how do you see the feedstocks landscape, right? And I request you to kind of address that in a couple ways, right? One is you're just coming off of a stint looking at feedstocks and energy issues for a large chemical company for a few years, but then also maybe more broadly, right? I mean, how does SABIC view some of this feedstocks issue on a more broad basis?
Yeah. So kind of just, if you look at SABIC's dependence on feedstocks, SABIC has, I would say, maybe 4 major feedstocks that it relies on. One is C1, C2, C3, so the lower carbon feedstocks. And then we have also product lines that are C6 or benzene forward type of product lines, right? So I would say these 4 really determine our future in terms of the cost position. And I definitely agree with what Bob just said, that although the shale gas, given the current fuel dynamics in terms of the downward pressure on oil and all of that, is currently seeing a rough patch, but it's just too abundant and too cheap to ignore, right? It will find a new equilibrium as the supply demand evolves coming from the COVID crisis, but I don't think it is something that we can ignore. And I still believe the US will be an important place with availability of cheap feedstocks for at least for the foreseeable future. The the point that I would like to add to what just Bob said, people think that the C1, C2, C3 feedstocks are independent from oil and naphtha. And because in the US, there is a larger proportion of wet gas, what ends up happening is the two are almost tied at the hip, right? Because there is demand for the oil as well as this demand for C1, C2, C3. And so the upstream companies are producing both. What will be interesting to see is, due to the whole vehicle electrification piece, as the downward pressure on oil emerges, how do this production dynamics change where it is no longer viable just because of the lower demand for one product pool, that the producers adjust accordingly to see how much of the C1, C2, C3s can get them out of that the negative pressure on the oil piece, right? And so that's something that we'll have to closely watch in the future, that how does the downward pressure on the vehicle fuel demand impact the production of the C1 to C3 type feedstocks. Of course, if it's a dry formation that you're trying to get the gas from, I think that should still be relatively robust because it's independent, but all the wet gas ones are tightly coupled from that standpoint.
So, Bob, coming back to you, you made a very strong case for shale and its availability and its long-term, how it's a pretty large resource and for a very long period of time, right? It's going to be available at very cost-competitive prices. But given the broader dynamics that we are seeing in the oil markets, right? And if you take another step back, right? I mean, a lot of the NGL production has been tied to associated gas production, right? I mean, if you look at where the bulk of the NGL production is coming in the US, it's coming from Permian, it's coming from the Marcellus. A lot of the growth that we have seen in NGL production has happened in the Permian, but a lot of that is happening because oil prices, because a lot of those producers want to produce oil, and in the process, right, they're producing NGLs. Now, as oil prices fall, and as we all know, right, that the first chunk that falls off of the supply curve when oil prices fall is to a large extent shale production here in the US, light tight oil production from shale here in the US. What does that mean for NGLs going forward, coming out of the US? Is it unreasonable to say that a lot of the cost competitiveness that we have seen for NGLs coming out of the US might be challenged, let's say, in the next 10 years?
Well, I'm not big on NGLs. I'm more of a polymer guy, but oil prices vacillate quite a bit. And there have been periods when the shale gas, well, certainly shale oil, has been uneconomical. But the oil producers don't want to keep oil at $30 forever or $40 forever. They're losing a lot of money as well. So I tend to believe we're going to be up in cycles. We're going to see ups and downs. But for the majority of the time, I think the shale gas and shale oil will be economical. So based on that, yeah, you will have some intermediate supply disruptions, but it's all there. And at the end of the day, I still believe it's going to be a very favorable environment for investment.
Dhaval, would you like to maybe chime in on that? Do you see, I mean, I don't know, I'm assuming that NGL supply is something that you guys pay quite a lot of attention to. And I'm curious if you see that differently in the decade.
So, yeah, so it's a very interesting dynamic, and I'll confess that this is something that we are all waiting to at least some steady state or an equilibrium emerge, because it has been so volatile over the last year. It is very hard to draw conclusions, but I'll mention some anecdotal pieces that we have come across in our discussions with some of the midstream folks. And it exactly connects to the whole NGL point that you were just making, Uday, that this was a story that we heard out of the Bakken, where what ended up happening is they were producing both the NGLs, the light C1 type fraction and the shale oil fraction. And they had robust demand for certain portions of the product, mainly the C1 and shale oil. And they had to clog back on the production because there was not enough demand for the mid carbon compounds, right? And they ran out of capacity. And that's why they had to kind of choke back on the production, and that somehow also impacted the overall operating economics of the facility. And so having a robust demand, which is balanced across that entire spectrum of all the different carbon numbers that come out, is quite essential to really understand where you're going from an equilibrium standpoint, and what are the final prices that the producer will set. And so I believe that if there is that imbalance, a couple of things will emerge. One is, how you valorize and can you convert them into compounds that probably have a higher demand fraction? So that we see that as one trend that could develop. The other piece is, if I'm a producer and there's a certain carbon number that either I have to flare or I don't know what to do with it, will it bump up the pricing for, let's say, C1 or the shale oil fraction, which you might be used to a low one, but essentially in order to be profitable, they have to bump those up, the ones with a robust demand, to a higher pricing. And so I would say the jury is out as to how that whole equilibrium will pan out. But in general, what we believe is that balance has to occur in some form or fashion, right? And it will either show up in terms of pricing, or it will show up in terms of volumes being taken out of the market to achieve the appropriate price sets that you need.
That's helpful, Dhaval. Now, if we switch gears a little bit and start talking about NAFTA, right? I mean, clearly this year, NAFTA has enjoyed some relative competitiveness, right, in the market. But again, you know, on similar lines, you could argue, right, that if you believe that oil is basically headed to some sort of a structural surplus over the next, let's say, decade or so, because of various factors, primarily lack of demand growth, right? And eventually demand decline. Does that mean that a lot of NAFTA-based production will be a lot more advantaged relative to where they have been over the past decade? And would that, I guess, compress the differentials, margin differentials between, let's say, ethane-based crackers versus NAFTA-based crackers? I'm curious how you think about NAFTA's competitiveness.
Okay, you want me to take that, Uday? Sure. Yeah. So, and this is a debate that we have even within the company the whole time, right? And so of course, there's a classical cost curve, and you see where your C2, C3 olefins are placed on the cost curve with respect to the different feedstocks. Now, I personally believe there is a fundamental difference in the chemistry of ethane cracking and naphtha cracking, and Bob alluded to it, that ethane cracking is going to give you ethylene, whereas naphtha cracking is going to give you C2, C3, C4, C5, BTX, a little bit of the fuel pool, so on and so forth. So what ends up happening, at least in our opinion, is the downstream demand of the C3 and C3 plus intermediates will actually determine the viability of the naphtha cracker going forward, right? And ethylene will be something that the naphtha cracker makes, by the way, because it is not really targeted towards an ethylene production vehicle, right? So what will happen is, as the naphtha crackers have come under pressure, again, given the inherent cyclicality of the business, what will happen is the downstream demand at some point of time for the C3 plus products will have to be met. There will be a certain price that will be given by these particular downstream folks to the people who supply those feedstocks. And that will inherently bring the viability of the naphtha cracker back to a certain level, right? And so I think the way you should view the naphtha cracker is, what is the holistic demand for all the products that the naphtha cracker makes? And are they balanced? And which is a rate determining step on that? So the slowest demand increase is the one that will decide when you build the next naphtha cracker. At least, so that's how we tend to view the naphtha cracker.
So if I may maybe summarize that, right, just to make sure that we clarify some of these things. I think what you're saying is that ethylene demand by itself is not the driver for naphtha-based, and for naphtha as a feedstock and its relative competitiveness, but it's the co-products that you're getting, right? And maybe the heavier co-products which act almost as some sort of floor for naphtha's use in ethane, in steam crackers.
That's
but,
correct.
but they also limit potential growth
Yes.
of the feedstock.
That's correct.
So
That's correct.
It kind of has some sort of a
Yeah.
double-edged sword there.
So the other way to think about it, Uday, and I think you bring up a very good point, right? Let's say if the price of naphtha in a theoretical world became lesser than ethane, you would still not go out and build a whole bunch of naphtha crackers because you still need to figure out what to do with all those co-products and is there a robust demand for them? Yeah.
No, very good. That's very insightful, Dhaval. Thanks. So Bob, switching back a little bit to olefins and further downstream, right? If we look specifically at olefins, right? What are some of the big trends? You know, you alluded to propylene shortages earlier, but you know, can you give us some sort of an overview of what's happening from an olefin supply demand point of view today and maybe going forward?
Yeah, you really have to look at olefins as ethylene and propylene because they're quite different. You know, if you're making polyethylene or ethylene glycol or any ethylene derivatives, you need to be back integrated into ethylene. That's, I think, a fundamental. Second, when you build a cracker today, it's an ethane cracker. They're all basically integrated. In other words, you build the ethane cracker, you build the ethylene, and you build the derivatives that are going to consume that ethylene. People do not build ethylene today to go into the merchant market. So they may build a little excess in case they want to expand and don't want to build a new cracker. But at the end of the day, we have major investments. And today, I would say, if you're going to build a new ethane cracker today with some derivatives, you're really starting at around $6 billion to start. And you can go up to maybe $10, $12 billion, depending upon where you're located. Shell, for example, I think they're going to wind up with over $10 billion cost in the cracker up there in Pennsylvania. Whereas if you build on an integrated site here in the Gulf Coast, you're talking maybe more about $6 billion. But that's a very big investment today. So companies have got to really be sure, one, they're going to have the shale gas and it will be competitive in the export market. Because at the end of the day, the US demand does not need all of the polyethylene that is being produced. US demand is actually met by existing crackers. So now we see a tremendous move into the export market. So companies have got to be looking at the long term, 10, 15, 20 years for these investments. So they're saying, I'm betting and I'm investing because ethane is always going to be the feedstock of choice. And no matter where oil price goes, I'm going to have some advantage. Propylene, much different. You know, propylene comes basically today. Refineries are still an important part of propylene supply, but limited. I don't see much more coming out of refineries in North America for the propylene. The new norm is on-purpose propylene, and PDH is propane dehydrogenation is the way to go, at least for most companies. But it's not simple. PDH plant costs probably over $1 billion right now for a 500,000 ton unit. It has operating problems. It has had startup problems. Considering how long the technology has been available, it's still difficult to start up one of these new plants, but there's no other option. And in PDH, you have also sort of a split. You have companies like Enterprise that are building it for the merchant market, not for self-use. And then you have companies like Formosa, which is building a PDH and polypropylene plant together. So propylene is quite different than ethylene. And I think those are the dynamics that are going to be with us. On-purpose propylene will be the way to go in the future.
Thanks, Bob. So switching gears a little bit, right? I mean, clearly the next 10, 15 years, right? People are talking about the energy transition. There's going to be, significant shifts. I think it's reasonable to expect around broader energy hydrocarbon market. So what is how do chemical companies prepare for this from a feedstock point of view? Right? I mean, people are talking about crude to chemicals. Over the past decade in general, there's been a lot of interest in bio-based feedstocks. I'm curious, what does the universe of alternative feedstocks looks like? Which of them seem promising, commercially viable, realistic? Dhaval, maybe we'll start that with you.
Sure, sure. So at least what we are observing on the alternative feedstock, somehow one might not think that in a highly commoditized business like that you would observe significant market segmentation, but interestingly, we're actually observing market segmentation, right? So for some of the sustainable products, like you mentioned, it could be plastics waste based or biomass based. If people are figuring out, and that's what SABIC has done with its asset in Europe, where we are taking some of these feedstocks and integrating it into the naphtha that goes through our cracker and providing a certain amount of sustainable footprint to our customers. We are seeing a robust demand for those kind of feedstocks, right? But of course, it is from very small base volumes that we are going to be growing there. On the other side, we see more of the conventional one, that the lowest cost player will be the one that will have the most strength with the customer. But even the interesting dynamic that we are observing there is, in addition to the plastics waste, the whole decarbonization effort is really taking steam, and different companies are planning now different types of CO2 numbers for the futures, and really seeing that if I have to include a decarbonization type approach into my asset, including that, what is my delivered cost to the customer? And so there is a shift even on the commodity side, the pure commodity side of the business, to really start planning for the whole decarbonization wave that is going to come our way over the next 10 to 20 years, and start baking that into our plans. We still believe that, back to the point that Bob made early on, that the shale-based feedstocks will be very attractive, but you will have to do something over and above to ensure that you are meeting the decarbonized needs for the world of tomorrow. Or if you're focusing on a liquid-based asset, you have a mechanism to integrate some of the plastics waste and such, so that you can position it with the appropriate segments of the customers who really need that.
Bob, in terms of alternative feedstocks, how do you see that? Do you see new opportunities there? Do you see potential to maybe conceptualize new plans that are based entirely on new feedstocks? I'm curious how you see that landscape.
Well, methanol, for example, has experienced a tremendous change in North America, going from a net importer to a net exporter. And methanol is a feedstock for olefins. There are some MTP to propylene and MTO to olefins plants that are operating. There's more of an interest in that because methanol has become less expensive and more available. It's easy to transport. So I see more methanol-based facilities over the next decade or two. Coal, I think, is only going to be in China. I don't see coal investments going outside of China at all. Too many issues with pollution, and you almost have to subsidize the coal industry. Although, when you look at West Virginia, a coal-based plant, if it ever becomes, I would say, economically acceptable, environmentally acceptable, there's one place where they could need it, because coal in West Virginia is a disaster. There's some work going on now, I guess, with oil directly to chemicals, oil to olefins. I don't know much about that. I've read a little bit about it, but people are looking at trying to find a place for oil other than burning it in a gasoline. So there are some work in alternate feedstocks. I never have been, I would say, a fan of bioplastics. It's not that it doesn't work, it's just that the cost is too high. And as you have more capacity for polyethylene and polypropylene coming on, that cost differential will keep bioplastics relegated to special uses. Companies that want to have an absolute green impact, and people are willing to pay more for it. But I really don't see that taking over a large segment of the business. So to me, it's ethane, propane, methane, and naphtha for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Bob. Dhaval, how do you see, you mentioned decarbonization, for example. Is decarbonization possible from a feedstock point of view? And what would that pathway look like, right? Or I'm assuming that decarbonization strategies for chemical polymer players would be, I guess, maybe live with the existing slate of feedstocks, but maybe co-feed some lower carbon intensity feedstocks and things like that. I'm curious if you can share some thoughts.
So that's a very good point, right? The fundamentals of all the polymer chemistry is it is going to be carbon based, right? So when you think about a chemical plant is doing two things, right? So one is it is taking a carbon feedstock and converting it into tangible products that we use, which are all carbon based. And on that front, I don't think you will see a decarbonization because it doesn't make sense, right? Now, the second thing that the chemical plant does is it takes a bunch of carbon feedstock, largely methane, and burns it to provide all the energy to do the transformations that are required within the plant. And in the process of doing that, it emits a bunch of CO2, right? And then the intensity of the plant is measured in terms of the tons emitted per ton of product you make. So when we talk about the decarbonization wave, it is largely directed at that energy source and how do you drive the CO2 footprint of that asset. If you look at the UN Sustainability Development Goals, they talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So there is CO2 footprint associated with all the three scopes. How do you minimize or reduce that to zero? And you will see a lot of companies have come out with the whole carbon neutrality announcement, even countries, right? I think China came out with an announcement within the last couple of days to be carbon neutral by 2060. And so I think that's where I think the petrochemical industry will focus on how to get its energy decoupled from the intense CO2 footprint that it comes with today.
Excellent. That's helpful. And maybe we'll kind of bring this conversation to a close at that point. I don't know if there are parting thoughts or topics that you'd like to bring up as we are wrapping things up. Bob, any parting thoughts here for us?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things. First, the impact of COVID-19 has really hurt demand. And if you look at company releases in terms of profitability, I think essentially every company is reporting a loss first and second quarter. However, that has rebounded dramatically since June. You look at the polymer business, the feedstock business, June, July, August, September, October, price increases. Part of it is because demand has picked up a little bit in the second half and there's a lot of idle capacity. Second thing is we unfortunately did have another hurricane. So we always will have these external factors, whether it's COVID or hurricanes or something that's going to impact the industry. So that's one thing. I'm looking actually for demand growth, assuming there is a vaccine by the first quarter. I am looking for polymer demand growth, which of course drives feedstocks, to be above expectations, above GNP. Automotive, for example, will probably rebound stronger once people start working. So people have to rebuild inventory. You know, along the supply chain, people are running down with minimum inventories. Producers today for polymers, some are below 10 days. So if you look at 21 and 22, I think they're going to be very strong years for the polymer and feedstock business. I think people will go ahead and I think start reinvesting. And I say start, I think COVID has delayed new investments and it has delayed projects under construction. So that's also another benefit for 21, 22. We have a number of big projects, Canada, Texas, that are not going ahead. If you look at I would say the robustness of the industry, right now there are 9 new crackers that have been announced, some under construction, and that's roughly about 9 million tons of new capacity, maybe a little more. They all will not go ahead because there are some issues and they all will be delayed. And about 3 million tons of propylene have been announced for PDH plants and expansions. So I'm still bullish on the industry. We will overcome COVID-19 and we will emerge strong.
I love that optimism, Bob. Dhaval, I guess, parting thoughts here for us.
Sure. So, by the way, the observations that Bob made are quite similar, right? The chemical industry is a cyclical, short cycle industry. So we feel the effect the first, and we also see the benefits the first coming out of a tough time like this, right? And so, our view is, given the number of crackers that are going to be built, we'll still be structurally long ethylene for some time. So it will take some time for that equilibrium to emerge. So it might be maybe a couple of years further out than what Bob mentioned. And then just wanted to make one remark. We spoke about oil to chemicals briefly, and just again, I know that there is a significant emphasis to really put oil into chemicals as the oil demand maxes out. And it does structurally have some of the same challenges that I described about the naphtha cracker, right? So once you put oil to a chemical of some kind, it is still going to naturally want to make a whole host of products versus just ethylene alone. So some of the same dynamics that we described for the naphtha cracker also apply to the oil case. So that's just kind of one clarifying point. But overall, I think the petrochemical industry will emerge strong out of this. It is an essential industry, and I think once the equilibrium hits, it will definitely be back to good old times for the industry.
Back to good old times is a good slogan here for us to end our conversation here. Hey guys, thank you again. I appreciate you making time for this chat here today. We are hopeful to have FlexPo in person in the next year, and are hoping that you'll come back and talk to our clients and audience. But in the meantime, thank you very much. And we'll be back again shortly with another edition of Digital Conversations under FlexPo Plus shortly. With that, thank you again.